given that the World Cup is only 2 months away, I wanted to pick a national team and do a little scouting report. Essentially, look at the players for said national team and see how they're doing at club level. Look at their form, look at the club's form, and just see how their overall style of play is going right now, 2 months away from the World Cup. How is everyone doing for that specific team? So the team that I chose this weekend to kind of do scout out and see the players was Belgium, a team who I believe are second on the FIFA World Cup rankings as far as national teams are concerned. I know people have their qualms with the rankings, but nonetheless, Belgium still are a very highly rated team, and there's a lot of expectation for this team going into the World Cup. So I wanted to see how their players are doing. Obviously, we have Kevin De Bruyne going off with Manchester City. Romelu Lukaku is back at Inter Milan, although he's a little bit injured right now. I think Roberto Martinez, the coach of Belgium, has a lot of choices to make. Even between the sticks, he hasn't picked Courtois a lot. He's kind of been going with Mignolet recently, but at the end of the day, maybe it was just more of like Courtois was on a Champions League run, so he didn't really want to use them, considering that Belgium were pretty much already qualified for the World Cup. So he's been using a lot of players in rotation. But now that the World Cup is getting closer and closer and closer, I kind of wanted to see, if I was Roberto Martinez, who would I go with? And just to see how are the Belgian players doing right now. And if you're a Belgian fan, are you concerned? Are you happy with how everyone's doing? So yeah, I ended up catching 5-6 games with a specific emphasis on seeing players that would most likely play for Belgium this November at the 2022 FIFA World Cup. I ended up starting at the country of origin, the Belgian league, catching Club Brugge against Cercle Brugge. The specific players that I really wanted to look at, though, was Hans van Aken. So Roberto Martinez has been starting Hans van Aken wide right for a lot of these past Belgian games. And I wanted to see how he was doing because, playing in the Belgian league, it's not as high profile. He's not playing against the most tough opponents week in, week out. So I wanted to see, what did Martinez see in van Aken? And I'll be honest, didn't see much, man.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And the thing is, I can't be too critical because it's not like he had a bad game. He just didn't really do anything positive either. I would say it was a very neutral performance. He wasn't that involved. I was expecting him as captain of the club. I was expecting him to demand the ball, be involved offensively, kind of pull the strings creatively for the club. But honestly, he had a pretty passive game.
Neither added nor detracted from.
Exactly. So I can't necessarily criticize his play, but I don't know if I'm hopeful as him starting as your right winger for the Belgium national team, especially if you're trying to make a deep run. Now, maybe I just caught him on an off day, but it's funny because even the commentator was like, dang, Van Aken is not really doing anything in this game. And I'm glad he said that because I know I wasn't crazy. I was like, okay.
Him out.
Yeah, I honestly called him out. I was like, okay, thank God Van Aken wasn't doing anything in this game. So I thought that was very interesting. And it could be a point where maybe he's out of form. Maybe he's just out of form, which we could see maybe someone else starting in that position come World Cup time.
Yeah.
It kind of makes sense. He's 30 years old, just kind of getting out of his prime physically, so maybe that age is starting to kick in. Obviously, though, he's still highly touted as a player, and I could see moments where I'm like, okay, I can see what he could do, but as far as that 90 minutes was concerned, honestly, he didn't do much. Other players that I was interested in seeing was Simon Mignolet. He had a good game, didn't really have much to do because Cercle Bruges' offense honestly was just less advanced compared to Club Bruges' defense, so they just couldn't get any open shots. They really couldn't damage Club Bruges in any certain way. So Mignolet honestly had a very good game, but he didn't really have to make any big saves. Another player I wanted to see was Diedrich Boyata. Boyata has been the main center back for Roberto Martinez in pretty much every game these past couple months. But I think he's coming off of some sort of injury, or maybe he was in rotation because he ended up coming on late in the game when the game was already done. I think the game ended up being like 4-0. Ended up being a pretty easy game for Club Brugge. Again, Cercle Brugge did try, but ultimately you could just see there's a huge class difference as far as skill was concerned. Not really much to take away from this game, honestly, from a Belgian perspective, because no one really popped off. No one really took the game into their own hands to dominate. So that's my takeaway. Hans van Aken might not be the starting right winger for Roberto Martinez come World Cup time, which that's interesting because who does he go at that point? I'm not 100% sure. No transition. I ended up catching the Borussia Dortmund Hoffenheim as my second game that I caught this weekend. So from a Belgian player perspective, because that's what I had going into the game, I was specifically looking at Thomas Meunier and Torgan Hazard. And I actually got to see both players. Bino Gittins ended up getting injured, so Torgan Hazard ended up coming on pretty early into the game. So I got to see both of them play pretty much over an hour. Again, it was hard to get a true takeaway from this game from a informed Belgian player perspective because the game itself was so chippy. I can't criticize either Hazard or Meunier because there was never a time where they really got exposed. Hoffenheim had a really piss poor first half, could not get it on the ball, did not get close to Borussia Dortmund's defensive half. So Meunier, from a defensive perspective, didn't have to do much. He looked good on the ball, looked involved offensively when he needed to. His one-on-one defending was excellent. He looked good. But he also didn't have any chances for him to get exposed because Hoffenheim weren't really going at Dortmund, and they just couldn't. They were second best on the day. Hoffenheim ultimately did kind of get back into it in the second half, but Dortmund still looked kind of comfortable, I'll be honest. And I can say pretty much the same thing about Torgan Hazard. He never really got going offensively, although I will say I think Torgan Hazard is one of those weird players where he has some really spectacular games, but the majority of his games are just solid, you know? And that's kind of what I've come to expect out of Torgan now is that, like, overall, he's a good, solid player, but his spectacular moments are pretty few and far in between. I think that's what you can expect if he is going to play for the Belgian national team is that he's going to give you some good minutes, but overall, I don't think he's going to be your go-to guy offensively. He's not going to be your go-to guy to create. But if you need him to come off the bench, just get fresh legs and run, defend if you need him to, or attack if you want him to get involved, he's your go-to guy. I guess those were just my major takeaways. Not much to get out of this Dortmund game, and it was mainly just because it was a stale game from just a competitive perspective. I finally caught a banger, and that game was the Italian Milan derby, AC Milan against Inter Milan. You know, and a part of me thinks, what if they had Belgium number 9, Romelu Lukaku, who unfortunately was injured for this game. But part of me thinks if he was on the pitch, it definitely could have been a different result, just given how lethal of a striker he is. But either way, an incredible game, regardless if he was playing or not. AC Milan with a big 3-2 win. I specifically wanted to see Charles de Ketelaere, the young Belgian forward. And this guy's interesting, man. So he gets the start for Milan. This kid's interesting. He kind of reminds me positionally of a Kai Havertz or an Antoine Griezmann. Again, not in style of play because he has a completely different style. The way he touches the ball is completely different compared to those two players that I just mentioned. But positionally, he's very similar. And what I'm trying to get at is he's a secondary striker. He has that big 6'4" frame, and you'd think, oh, this guy's a traditional number 9. He's going to lead the line. But no, he doesn't. He actually likes to kind of drop deep and be that secondary striker to where he can combine with his midfielders in Tonali or Benacer, or combine with his striking partners in Rafael Leao. So he plays that really interesting pocket role as the secondary striker. But what gets me about De Ketelaere is that he might be too stretched skill-wise. He might be very good at a lot of things where I think career-wise he'd be better off if he honed in on one or two very specific things. What I'm ultimately getting at is that De Ketelaere is so talented. There's moments where you'd see him penetrate, dribble inside. There's moments where you'd see him get big in the box and try to catch a header off a cross. There's moments where you'd see him do really good hold-up play, drop it off to his midfielders. There's moments where you'd see him try and get creative, maybe do a through ball, maybe do a ball over the top. He does a lot, and he has a lot of variety to his offensive game. But it kind of gets me to where, what is he really good at? Because I don't think he's an elite passer yet. I don't think he's elite at hold-up play. I don't think he's the best in the box. And I'll be honest, even though it's why he ultimately gets paid, I don't know if he's the best finisher. I don't know if he's that clinical. So he's really good at all of those categories, but he doesn't shine in any particular one of them. But that's still the reason why you play him, is because you know he is very good at them. He's very technical and he's very talented. And that's the thing, is that he's still so young. So I'm really curious to see where he takes his career. I'm glad that Milan sees the talent in him. They just got him this offseason, and already he's making an impact. And this was probably the biggest game of his career, even though he's played in Champions League games back in Belgium. earlier in his career. This was probably the biggest game of his career, and I thought he passed with flying colors because, again, he had a very involved and a very good game. But I'm very curious to see what he does in the next years as he develops, as he grows up, as he turns into his prime, as he becomes a true professional. I'm curious to see the final form of the Ketelaere, because right now, I don't think anybody knows. And even if they say they do, I don't think anybody knows what the final form of the Ketelaere is. But he's such an interesting player because you can see he has so much potential. And honestly, I love it. I love seeing players like this because it's just an X factor. And that's my ultimate takeaway for De Ketelaere is that I think he will play, he will feature for Martinez at this World Cup, but I'm just curious to see in what way. I could easily see him starting, maybe as that secondary striking partner alongside Romelu Lukaku. I easily could see him playing that role in that starting position. Or I could see him being that super sub. Maybe when Belgium, it's 0-0 at halftime, Martinez needs a guy to come on, give a little bit more offensive creativity. I think De Ketelaere can be Roberto Martinez's go-to guy for an offensive impetus if Belgium need goals or if they need creativity. So I think if you're Belgium, you're really excited about this guy because you don't know what you're going to get, but in a really good way. And, you know, come 4 years' time, maybe in 2026, Belgium might have maybe one of the best strikers on the planet, De Ketelaere, if he maximizes his potential. So yeah, that was one of the bigger takeaways I got from this game. If you're Belgian, I'd say you're really excited about De Ketelaere. So after that banger of a game that I caught in Italy, I had to come down. You know, I peaked. I had a high.
Come back to earth.
So I had to come back down to earth, settle back into reality on the calm down. And to do that, I ended up watching Atletico Madrid play against Real Sociedad. And this one gets really interesting because I would love to know what the Belgian people, any Belgian fans, think about these two players specifically. So first I want to start off with Axel Witsel, Atletico's new signing that they got from Borussia Dortmund this summer. Off the bat, in Diego Simeone's first game of the season, he chose to put Axel Witsel as the starting center back in a back three. And it gets interesting because Witsel, for his entire career, has actually played a little bit further up the pitch in a defensive midfield position. And he plays that exact position for Roberto Martinez for the Belgium national team. In a way, he is playing out of position for Atletico. And that's the thing is that week in, week out, every day in training, he's playing as a center back for Atletico. The thing is, I don't think it's the worst change of position for Witsel because his defensive midfield attributes do translate to a sweeper center back position. He's very good at scanning the field in front of him, and he's very good at anticipating where the ball is going to go so he can cut out any offensive chances that his opponents create. Witzel's very, very good at doing that. He's an excellent defensive-minded player. So going from defensive mid to a sweeper center back position, I think does make sense from a translative point of view. But where it gets interesting is I wonder how that's going to affect him when he gets called up by Martinez, you know, because being a center back, you have the entire pitch and the entire play in front of you. Ideally, if you're a good center back, the only person behind you is your goalkeeper.
Goalie, yeah.
That's it. And so where it's going to get interesting is when he goes back to play in the World Cup for Martinez, he's got to play in that midfield position. It's been Witsel De Bruyne, Witsel De Bruyne, Witsel De Bruyne. Those are the two midfielders that Martinez likes to put in the middle of the pitch. So he's going to be in that position come World Cup time. But I'm curious to see how he's going to adapt given that week in, week out, he is a center back for Atletico. And I wonder if you're Belgian, are you a little worried about that? Because I kind of would be. If you're center back, the entire play, all your opponents are in front of you. But when you get put in that midfield position, you know, you kind of have to be aware of a 360 surroundings. You got to know who's behind you. You got to know who's to your side. You got to know who's in front of you. And then you do the same thing. You scan, you try to block out plays, you try to anticipate. And that's why I'm not too worried because Witsel is very good at doing that. I'm wondering, will he be just a little rusty come World Cup time when he has to go back to that position? I am wondering. I'm not going to say I'm worried, but I would be a little concerned. Kind of in a similar vein, the other player that does actually play for Atletico who is Belgian is Yannick Ferreira Carrasco. Carrasco's a interesting player, man, because, you know, for so long, he's been one of the more talented players for Belgium, one of the most offensive threats that they've had. When you think about offensive creators for this Belgium national team for the past 10 years, Carrasco's in that conversation. I'd say De Bruyne, Lukaku, Eden Hazard, and Yannick Carrasco have been the go-to guys as far as offensive chances are concerned when you're talking about this Belgium national team. But man, Carrasco, I'm going to go ahead and say he's been a little out of form I'm going to go ahead and say maybe like a year to a year and a half now.
That long?
Yeah. A while. And it's to the point where, he's had injuries. Maybe he's not always that healthy. He's not always that fit. And the thing is, Martinez, I think he also sees that too. He hasn't been calling up Carrasco that often. But again, it's because he was injured for a long time last year. Ultimately, I still think he's obviously going to be called up for Belgium because he's just so naturally talented. You can't not call him up because of that. But I wonder what his impact is going to be, because I do think that Carrasco is out of form. From an offensive perspective, I'm actually kind of worried about the wing play on this Belgium national team, because think about Hans van Aken, the player that I saw play in Belgium this past weekend. Wasn't really involved. Carrasco has been out of form for 12 months now, and it doesn't look like he's really going to get back into it. The reason why you play Carrasco is because there is a 20% chance that he's just going to do something amazing, that he's going to do something spectacular. And that's why you play him, because there's still a significant chance that he's just going to blow past a guy, do a crazy assist, or just penetrate, get past 3 players and score. There is that chance, so you can't risk that by not playing him, because maybe you need that in a stalemate game where it's 0-0 and you just need somebody to do something individualistic.
Right.
Carrasco's that guy.
He will still push for greatness at times.
That is exactly it. He can still give you chances of greatness. And that's the biggest reason why I would play Carrasco. But again, if you think about Van Aken, who's a little bit out of form, if you think about Carrasco, who's a little bit out of form, Eden Hazard hasn't played football for 2-3 years now since his big leg injury. So offensively, who do Belgium rely on? Centrally, I think Belgium are locked in. You have Romelu Lukaku, you have X-Factor Charles de Ketelaere, and behind them, you have Kevin De Bruyne, who's one of the best passing midfielders of our time, still firing on all cylinders. So I think centrally, Belgium are completely fine offensively. But when you go wide, I don't think Belgium really have anybody to rely on. Van Aken doesn't look that good. Carrasco is out of form. And again, Eden Hazard is just coming off of injuries, and he just cannot get match fit. He's barely getting any minutes for Real Madrid. It brings about an interesting question for Belgium. Who are going to be your creative wingers? And do you have any that are in form right now? Think about Salamakers playing for Milan, who did get some minutes in that Italian derby. I'm not fully convinced by him either. So, I don't know. Going forward for this Belgium team, I'd say your biggest points of weakness are going to be your offensive wing play. Yeah, so to finish up my little Belgium scouting report, the last game that I caught was at the Amex, Brighton versus Leicester City. The players I actually wanted to see were on, piss poor Leicester's side, because they have like 4 Belgian players, man. Dennis Prout,
Really?
Voigt Weiss, Yuri Tielemans, and Timothy Castan. Only 2 of them played though. That was Castan and Tielemans. So I was actually really excited to see Tielemans specifically, because I think he does have a role to play for Martinez come World Cup time. It'll be interesting though, because where does he actually fit in? He has so much talent. He ended up getting a crazy assist actually against Brighton on this game. A beautiful over-the-top ball that eventually Patson Daka finished. So Tielemans, from that small snippet of play, looked good. But for the rest of the game, man, just could not get on the ball. But thing is, I don't know if I blame him, because Leicester as a whole were really, really bad. So I can't be too critical of Tielemans, because it wasn't just him. The entire 11 of Leicester just looked completely out of sync. They looked off it. They were not a good club on the day. But again, Tielemans, I think he does have a role to play for Belgium, even though club-wise, his team is just not looking good. But the reason why I say that is because he does have a lot of skill on the ball, off the ball. He's a really good passer, but he's also pretty dynamic as a central midfielder. He's not going to be that guy that gets too offensively involved, because he does like doing the defensive side of things too. But when you need him to make that big through ball, you need him to do that really good ball over the top, a big switch, Tielemans has the class and the ability to do that. So that's why I think, regardless of how poor Leicester ultimately do going into the World Cup, I think Tielemans will easily get the call-up, and I think he will have a part to play for Belgium this winter. Where it gets curious, though, is I don't see him starting, and that's only because De Bruyne and Witsel they're just too good. and they completely occupy those two starting central midfielder roles for Martinez. But I can see Tielemans easily coming into rotation if they need some sort of offensive impetus. Tielemans can be that guy where maybe you take off Witsel, you sacrifice a bit of defensive mindedness, and you just put two offensive minded midfielders in De Bruyne and Tielemans. It might expose them a little bit defensively, but if Belgium need a goal, bringing Tielemans off the bench, I think, is a great choice to have if you're Roberto Martinez, man. So I think Tielemans will have a part to play this winter. And as for Castan, he's been getting a lot of calls for Belgium. Couldn't really analyze his play because he just wasn't getting on the ball. He was getting blown past a lot by these Brighton players. But you could say that about pretty much any of those Leicester players, man. They were that bad. So Castan probably will get the call-up regardless, just because he's been solid when he does play for Belgium. Martinez likes him. He likes starting him out wide as that wing back. And I don't really know who could really replace him, honestly. Maybe Salamakers, but it just depends on if Salamakers gets more minutes than Castan, if he's more in form. Right now, I think it's hard to tell. But I guess from an in-form point of view, I don't know if Castan's in the best form. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying about Carrasco. Wing-wise, Belgium might have some holes that they might not be able to replace come World Cup time. So yeah, those are my two takeaways from those Belgian players. But a player that's also interesting that wasn't on Leicester, that was for Brighton, Leandro Trossard, man, hasn't really been getting that many call-ups. But again, it's just because for so many years it's been Eden Hazard, it's been De Bruyne from a creative perspective, or Carrasco as a wingback. But Trossard has been making a case, man, at club level, going off with Brighton for these past 2 seasons. He has been making a case for himself to get called up and to have some sort of role to play for Belgium this winter, bro. Because I could see him maybe starting over Hazard. Actually, I could easily see him starting over Hazard. But the question will be, does Martinez go with that? Because Martinez hasn't really given Trossard those minutes yet. But it's because Trossard has just gotten going. He just started. He's a late bloomer. You know, he just started going club-wise last year where he popped off for Brighton, and he's continued that run of form. So if you're talking about players in form from an offensive, creative perspective, bro, Leandro Trossard is your guy for Roberto Martinez. But again, I do wonder if he's going to play him because he just hasn't built that relationship with him, coach to player yet. But maybe he says, you know what? Maybe I have that faith in him. He's playing so good for Brighton. Maybe he gives him those minutes. I think it'd be a risk worth taking just because he is in such good form right now for Brighton.
Okay, so with all that in mind, just kind of how you've laid out basically this thesis, if you will.
If you will.
I get the sense that you're trying to say that Belgium is not accurately ranked as second.
And I think that's a fair assessment. Ultimately, after watching these 5 games where I tried to scout out these Belgian players, if you say a team is in the top 5 in the world, to me that means they have to make a deep, deep run. I'm talking semifinals, no less. I'm talking about a team that can ultimately lift the trophy come the end of the World Cup. I don't think Belgium have it in them to do it. That's my ultimate analysis at this, and here's why. Maybe I'm repeating myself, but I think it's worth repeating. Centrally, you have probably some of the best in the world. Romelu Lukaku, X-Factor Charles de Ketelaere, Kevin De Bruyne, one of the best attacking midfielders, one of the best passers of the ball in the modern game. You have Kevin De Bruyne. And then alongside him, you have elite defensive-minded player Axel Witsel. So essentially, Belgium are a top 2, top 3 international team on the stage. But that's the thing. To be a World Cup winning side, you can't just have 3, 4 good players. You have to have a team. You have to have 11 players out there alongside your stars who fill in those holes where maybe you're lacking a little bit. You have to have players that can combine with your stars, players that can participate, whether it's defensively, offensively. Other than those 4 players that I just mentioned, I don't really see any other players filling in those holes enough to make Belgium a true title contender. Carrasco, Torgan Hazard, Eden Hazard, Hans Van Aken, Timothy Castan, if you will, all of their wide players, I don't know if I see enough offensively. And that's the thing. You need some sort of wing play. You cannot just play centrally. I'm going to question Belgium's creativity from a wing perspective. I don't know if they have what it takes to be a truly elite, complete team. Centrally, they look great. wing-wise, I just don't see it. I think a lot of their players who were incredible for them in years past, I'm talking about 2020, 2018, 2016, all of these players that made up the Belgian golden generation, they're all wing players. They're all wide, creative players. They're all out of form right now. And so looking at the sum of all of this, sure, they have some elite players and they will be very tough to beat. Their backline looks very solid with Boyata, Vertonghen. You add in world-class goalkeeper Thibaut Courtois in between the sticks, they're going to be very tough to beat. But again, to lift the World Cup, you have to be elite in every single position. And I think there's too much weakness out wide for Belgium to say that they can lift the trophy at the end of the tournament. But let me know y'all's thoughts on Belgium, their situation. I love any sort of conversation, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. I love reading y'all's comments. Yeah, and let me know if there's another international team that you guys want me to actually do a deep dive scouting report on. That'd actually be fun. And thanks again for watching. We'll see y'all next week.